10-minute murder.
Emmett Till was only 14 years old during the summer of 1955 when he traveled from his home in Chicago, Illinois, to stay with his relatives in the Mississippi Delta. It was in Mississippi that he had an interaction that changed the course of the rest of his short life, although at the time, he didn't even notice that he'd done anything wrong. Exactly what happened when Emmett Till met Carolyn Bryant in the grocery store she and her husband owned is still up for debate. At 21 years old, Carolyn was 7 years Emmett's senior, and crucially, unlike Emmett, she was white. After his short interaction with Carolyn, he was accused of many things: whistling at her in a casual manner, touching her, and even flirting with her brazenly. He might have done it because of a dare. He might not have been dared at all. He might not have even done it at all. Most of the witnesses seemed to agree that, whatever Emmett had done, he had not been obeying the unwritten rules of how a black boy should interact with a white woman in America's southern states. 2 days passed. At the time of her interaction with Emmett, Carolyn's husband, Roy, had been away in Texas. When he returned home, Carolyn initially didn't tell him whatever Emmett had said or done. Later, she explained that she tried to hide this information because she believed that if Roy found out, he would harm Emmett. However, Carolyn's secrecy was pointless. One of the grocery store's customers told Roy anyway. He was furious at his wife for keeping a secret, but he was even more mad at Emmett Till. Along with his half-brother, J.W. Milam, Roy tracked Emmett down to his great-uncle's house, where he was staying during his visit. Armed with pistols, the two men knocked on the door and demanded to see Emmett. Emmett's great-aunt offered J.W. and Roy money in exchange for not harming the boy, but they refused, continuing to demand that Emmett get dressed and come with them. After threatening the rest of the household to stay quiet, Roy and J.W. ordered Emmett to come out to their truck. Meanwhile, Emmett's great-uncle Mose Wright stayed awake, sitting on his porch and hoping that Emmett would come home. Eventually, he got into his own car and circled the nearby streets, looking for any sign of his great-nephew. The sun rose, and Emmett was still nowhere to be found. Mose was afraid for his own life, believing that Roy and J.W. would follow through on their promise to kill him if he contacted the police. Instead, Curtis Jones, Emmett's cousin, made 2 phone calls, one to Emmett's mother and the other to the LaFleur County Sheriff's Office. Sheriff George Smith paid a visit to Roy and J.W., who had clearly expected Emmett's family members to stay quiet. Reluctantly, both men admitted that they had taken Emmett with them on the previous night, but insisted that they had released him shortly afterwards, dropping him off in front of the grocery store that Roy and Carolyn owned. Sheriff Smith suspected that they were lying about that detail, but because both men had admitted to kidnapping Emmett, he was able to place them under arrest. Word spread quickly about the missing black teenager, and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, was alerted. 2 members of the NAACP staff went undercover as cotton pickers, asking black workers in the cotton fields about Emmett, but the search for the missing boy ended 3 days later after a body was found in the Tallahatchie River. 2 young boys were fishing when they came across a badly bloated, mutilated male human body. The body was completely naked and his facial features were unrecognizable, but there was a silver ring on one of his fingers. The ring had a unique engraving of the initials LT next to the date of May 25, 1943. That ring belonged to the missing 14-year-old Emmett Till. It was clear that after his abduction, Emmett had suffered terribly. He had been beaten severely, with one of his eyeballs protruding from the socket. He'd also been shot in the head, which appeared to be his cause of death. After Emmett's great-uncle Mose identified the body, Emmett's remains were transported back to his home in Chicago. His mother, Mamie Till, wasn't just grieving. She was furious, both at the killers and at the Jim Crow era, which had made it so dangerous for her son to simply exist while being black. Her fear and anger led her to a simple conclusion. Emmett's funeral would be public, and the casket would be open. She wanted everyone who attended to see what racism had done to her child. Emmett's funeral was attended by thousands, and pictures of his body were quickly distributed across Black newspapers and magazines all over the United States. But despite the public outcry, not everybody thought that Emmett's death had been an injustice, especially white people living in America's southern states. Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam went to trial for Emmett's murder in September of 1955. The day before the trial began, a Black man named Frank Young came forward, saying that he knew two other Black men who had witnessed Emmett being tortured. Their names were Henry Lee Loggins and Levi Collins, and they worked for J.W. Milam's brother. However, the prosecution was never told about these two potential witnesses. Instead, both Henry and Levi were placed in a local jail before the trial began, preventing them from testifying against Roy and J.W. The following day, the trial began. It was a spectacle, with almost 300 people, both Black and white, coming to the courtroom to watch. The selected members of the jury were all white and all male. Women and Black people were forbidden from participating. From its very beginning, the trial was incredibly relaxed, with the members of the jury being permitted to drink alcohol throughout the 5 days the trial continued. The defense suggested that the missing boy might actually still be alive, because the body found in the Tallahatchie River had been so damaged that it was impossible to positively identify it. They were leaning on that story that Roy and J.W. had initially told the sheriff, that they'd abducted Emmett to scare him, but released him unharmed shortly afterwards. Despite multiple eyewitnesses, the defense attorneys attempted to prove that there was no way Emmett's great-uncle Mose Wright would have been able to identify Roy and J.W. as perpetrators. It had been the middle of the night, and Mose only had the light of a flashlight to see. In a matter of minutes, Mose Wright went down in history, possibly becoming the first Southern Black man to testify against a white man in court and live to talk about it. Mose stood up to identify J.W. Milam as one of the perpetrators, saying, "There he is." The jury deliberated for just over 2 hours, taking a break in the middle to drink soda. They were aware that, in Mississippi, there were only 3 outcomes for Roy and J.W.: a death sentence, life in prison, or acquittal. Later, some members of the jury were interviewed and said that they made their decision because they believed that no white man should ever be killed or face life in jail for killing any Black man. Only one member of the jury believed that Roy and J.W. should be found guilty, but the rest of the jury were able to convince him to change his mind. Finally, the jury made their official decision. Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam were acquitted of Emmett Till's murder. In 1956, Roy and J.W. sold their story to Look magazine in exchange for $4,000 cash. They described how they killed Emmett and why. And even as they admitted that they'd murdered the boy, both of them still maintained that Emmett had deserved it because of his confidence and his treatment of Carolyn. When he was asked why he murdered Emmett, J.W. responded, "What else could I do? He thought he was as good as any white man." The public reaction to this interview was even more extreme than the reaction to Emmett's death. The outrage pushed the federal government to make changes in how Black people were treated in America, even contributing to the 1957 Civil Rights Act being passed. In 2006, the Tallahatchie Board of Supervisors established a memorial commission in Emmett's memory, and then issued a formal apology to Emmett's family. In the years since his death, Emmett has been the subject of countless poems, essays, and songs, to the point where he has been referred to as the sacrificial lamb of America's civil rights movement. His death inspired change, but only when it was too late to help Emmett, a 14-year-old boy who didn't think he had done anything wrong. That is 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, the host, and I really appreciate you listening. If you're new to 10-Minute Murder, welcome. Settle in, make yourself comfortable, and please subscribe now so that you can catch up more easily on all the back episodes. And also, it helps you find the new ones. All you have to do when you become a subscriber is just open whatever listening app that you have, and the episodes are automatically going to be right there for you. Connect with me on social media to stay up to date on what the podcast is doing, as well as see pictures of what we talk about here on the podcast. It's never gross and graphic, though. And hey, if you like this episode, please leave a rating and review on Apple, Spotify, Audible, any place that's possible. Your positive feedback is very much appreciated and helps the show grow. And finally, if you have a question, if you have something to share with me, maybe a story idea or anything else, you can email it to me, joe@10minutemurder.com. And that's going to do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening to 10 Minute Murder.